Picture for a moment a world without universities as we know them. No ivy-covered quads, no vast libraries filled with endless rows of books, no lecture halls buzzing with the energy of eager students. Now imagine that world enduring for centuries through invasions, plagues, and the collapse of empires, and yet somehow, against all odds, the light of learning was never extinguished. This is the remarkable, almost secret history of how knowledge survived in the Middle Ages, not in stone buildings, but in the hearts and minds of people. It's a story of resilience, creativity, and quiet heroism that unfolded in the shadows of what we often call the Dark Ages, and it all revolved around what can only be described as an invisible university. This invisible university wasn't a place you could find on a map. It had no central administration, no tuition fees, and no diplomas. Instead, it was a living, breathing network of monks huddled over manuscripts by candlelight, travelers sharing ideas along dusty trade routes, mentors teaching under open skies, and communities preserving wisdom through story, song, and symbol. These were the guardians of knowledge, working often in isolation but always as part of something larger, a distributed, decentralized web of learning that stretched across continents and centuries. They understood something profound, that knowledge isn't something that belongs to institutions. It belongs to people. It lives in the act of sharing, in the courage of curiosity, and in the stubborn refusal to let understanding die. What you're about to discover is how these hidden scholars and everyday keepers of wisdom achieved the extraordinary. We'll wander into silent scriptoria where entire libraries were copied by hand, journey with teachers who carried whole worlds of knowledge in their memory, and decode the symbols and strategies that kept ideas safe from destruction and decay. This isn't just a history lesson, it's an invitation to rethink what education really means and how it endures even when everything seems stacked against it. In many ways, their story mirrors our own digital age, where information flows freely across networks yet feels fragile in new ways. So settle in. You're about to uncover a lost chapter of human ingenuity, one that might just change how you see the power of learning forever. The collapse of the Roman Empire was not a single event but a slow, painful unraveling that stretched across generations. Imagine the roads that once connected a vast empire falling into disrepair, the aqueducts that brought fresh water to bustling cities running dry, and the forums where philosophers once debated lying silent. But perhaps the most devastating loss was the systematic dismantling of organized education. Roman society had built an impressive infrastructure for learning with public schools, libraries like the legendary Library of Alexandria, and academies where knowledge was formally passed down. As political order fractured and economic systems failed, these institutions were among the first casualties. Libraries were looted and burned, not out of malice against knowledge itself, but as symbols of a fading power or simply for their valuable materials. Schools closed their doors as teachers could no longer be paid, and the elite class that once supported the arts and sciences found itself struggling for basic survival. This era, which we now often call the Dark Ages, truly earned that name in an intellectual sense. With the breakdown of central authority came widespread instability, invasions, migrations, and constant warfare made settled scholarly life nearly impossible. Literacy rates, which had been relatively high in the Roman world, plummeted. The intricate language of Latin, the tongue of scholars and administrators, began to fracture into regional dialects, making communication across even short distances more difficult. The beautiful, standardized script used in official documents gave way to simpler, more rustic forms of writing. For a time, it seemed as if the collective knowledge of antiquity, the works of Greek philosophers, Roman engineers, and early scientists, might simply evaporate, becoming little more than a half-remembered legend. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming darkness, a crucial realization began to dawn on a scattered few. These were often monks, isolated scholars, or even thoughtful members of the remaining nobility. They saw that knowledge was not inherently tied to marble buildings or imperial funding. They understood that if the great institutions could no longer serve as guardians for learning, then the responsibility would have to fall to individuals and small communities. This was a profound shift in thinking. It moved the preservation of culture from a public, state-sponsored duty to a private, often personal, mission. This wasn't about building new great libraries. It was about saving what they could, one book, one idea, one student at a time. They began to consciously collect scattered manuscripts, to copy texts by hand wherever they could find them, and to teach others the skills of reading and writing. This decentralized, almost grassroots effort became the first stirring of what would later evolve into the Invisible University, a network of knowledge that existed not in stone, but in action and dedication. Imagine the profound silence of a monastery, broken only by the scratch of a quill on parchment. In these secluded havens, far from the turmoil of the outside world, a quiet revolution was taking place. Monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience added another unspoken vow: to become guardians of the written word. They transformed specific rooms into scriptoria, which literally means places for writing. This was not a casual activity. It was a sacred duty, a form of prayer conducted with the hand. The scriptorium was a highly organized space, often cold and dimly lit, with rows of desks where scribes would spend hours in focused silence. Their tools were simple but required immense skill. A sharp knife for cutting quills and scraping errors, pumice stone for smoothing the parchment, and inks painstakingly made from minerals, plants, and even crushed insects to create vibrant colors. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, each letter formed with a precision that bordered on devotion. A single monk might spend an entire year copying just one lengthy text, like the works of Virgil or a volume of theological commentary. This was not mindless repetition. It was an act of deep engagement where the scribe internalized the knowledge they were preserving, often adding their own tiny annotations or corrections in the margins, creating a silent dialogue with the ancient author. But to think of these spaces as mere production lines for books is to miss their true genius. The scriptoria were, in fact, the first true fortresses of learning, intellectual hubs that functioned like the servers and cloud storage of our modern age. Once a text was copied, it didn't just sit on a shelf. It became the center of intense study. Older, more experienced monks would often read aloud from the newly finished manuscripts to their brethren, turning mealtimes or breaks into impromptu lectures. Debates would spark over the meaning of a complex philosophical passage or the interpretation of a biblical verse. Younger monks learned to read and write by studying these very texts, creating a continuous cycle of education that passed knowledge directly from one generation to the next. The monastery itself became a living library, its walls containing not just books, but the collective understanding of those who had copied, studied, and debated them for centuries. This ensured that the flame of classical learning, though flickering, was never snuffed out. It was kept safe within these spiritual fortresses, waiting for a time when the world outside would once again be ready to receive its light. Now step inside the mind of a medieval reader encountering an illuminated manuscript for the very first time. In a world largely devoid of color and imagery for the common person, these books were dazzling, almost magical objects. The term illumination comes from the Latin illuminare, meaning to light up or to enlighten, and that's precisely what they did. Scribes and artists didn't just write words, they used precious materials to make the pages themselves seem to glow from within. Gold leaf, applied in delicate sheets and polished to a brilliant shine, would catch the flickering light of a candle or torch, making divine figures and important concepts literally shimmer. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a form of visual theology. The radiant gold represented the divine light of heaven, a physical manifestation of a spiritual truth that any viewer, literate or not, could immediately understand and feel in their soul. Beyond their breathtaking beauty, these manuscripts served a deeply practical and democratic purpose in a society where literacy was a privilege of the very few. For the vast majority of people, knowledge was received orally and visually. A beautifully illustrated page could tell a story, explain a complex biblical parable, or outline a scientific principle without a single word being read. Imagine a page depicting the parable of the Good Samaritan. A literate monk could read the Latin text, but a layperson could follow the entire narrative through the illustrations. The traveler being attacked by robbers, the indifference of the priest, and the compassion of the Samaritan tending to his wounds. The images acted as a universal language, breaking down the barrier between the educated elite and the common folk. They transformed abstract doctrine into tangible, memorable scenes, ensuring that key cultural and religious lessons were not confined to a small class of scholars, but were woven into the very fabric of society. The creation of these masterpieces was a testament to both global trade and local ingenuity. The vibrant blues came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone mined almost exclusively in Afghanistan and transported thousands of miles along trade routes. Reds were derived from crushed insects or vermilion, greens from copper compounds, and whites from lead. Each color carried its own symbolic weight and cost, making the production of a major illuminated book an incredibly expensive undertaking, often sponsored by a wealthy patron. This blend of far-flung resources and meticulous local craftsmanship turned each manuscript into a microcosm of the medieval world itself, connected, resourceful, and layered with meaning. They were not static repositories of information but dynamic cultural objects that fused art, science, religion, and history into a single, enduring form. By appealing to both the intellect and the senses, illuminated manuscripts ensured that knowledge wasn't just stored. It was experienced, felt, and remembered, passing from one generation to the next not as dry facts, but as a living, breathing part of their cultural identity. Long before ink touched parchment, knowledge lived in the human voice. For centuries, the most vital information, history, law, genealogy, even complex astronomical observations, was not stored on shelves but carried in the minds of specialized keepers. These were the bards who could recite epic poems spanning generations, the elders who held the collective legal wisdom of a people, and the storytellers who preserved a community's identity through tales told and retold around fires. They understood the power of sound and pattern to make information unforgettable. By weaving facts into rhythmic verse, setting them to melody, or structuring them with repetitive refrains, they transformed dry data into a living performance. A law wasn't just a rule, it was a line in a song everyone knew. A historical event wasn't a date in a book, it was a story with heroes and villains, told with such vivid emotion that listeners felt they had witnessed it themselves. This was a participatory form of education where the audience itself became a guardian of the knowledge, able to recite it back and pass it on, ensuring its survival through the sheer power of collective memory. As the medieval world grew more complex, the demand for preserving intricate theological arguments, philosophical concepts, and vast bodies of law pushed these ancient oral techniques to new heights. Scholars, particularly those within monastic and early university settings, began to systemize memory itself, developing what became known as the Ars Memorial, or the memory arts. This was not about rote repetition, but about constructing elaborate mental architecture. The most famous of these techniques, the method of loci, often called the memory palace, involved visualizing a familiar place like a grand cathedral, a bustling street, or even the rooms of one's own home. The scholar would then place each piece of information they needed to remember at a specific location within this mental space. To recall a complex philosophical argument, they would simply take a mental walk through their palace, retrieving each concept from where they had left it. Aristotle's view on ethics might be sitting on the bench by the door, a key theological quote might be hanging from a sconce on the wall, and a list of medicinal herbs could be arranged on the kitchen table. This technique leveraged the brain's powerful spatial and visual recall, allowing a single trained individual to hold the equivalent of an entire library in their mind, perfectly organized and ready for retrieval at a moment's notice. This skill was nothing short of revolutionary in a world where a single book could be worth more than a farm. For the wandering scholar, it meant they could travel light, their most valuable possessions secured safely between their ears. In a lively university disputation, it allowed a master to cite authorities and counter arguments without ever pausing to fumble through a fragile manuscript. The memory palace was the ultimate portable, secure, and durable knowledge technology. Its practice required immense discipline and training, turning the mind into a dynamic, organized repository. This emphasis on internalized knowledge fostered a deep, intuitive understanding that often went beyond what simple reading could provide. The act of constructing the palace forced the scholar to engage with the material, to categorize it, and to create meaningful connections between ideas. In this way, the invisible university existed not just in the physical networks of people and places, but within the very minds of its scholars, proving that the most resilient library of all is the one we build for ourselves. While the monasteries provided a stationary fortress for knowledge, an equally vital and far more mobile force was taking shape on the dusty roads connecting medieval towns and villages. Picture a lone figure, a leather satchel heavy with a few precious manuscripts slung over his shoulder, walking for days to reach the next village where a handful of eager students might be waiting. This was the peripatetic scholar, a teacher without a classroom, whose entire university existed in the spaces he could find, a quiet corner of a tavern, the shaded portico of a church, or the great hall of a sympathetic noble's castle. The term peripatetic itself comes from the Greek peripatein, meaning to walk about, hearkening back to Aristotle, who is said to have taught while strolling through the Lyceum. In the Middle Ages, this ancient tradition was reborn out of sheer necessity, transforming the very landscape of Europe into a potential lecture hall. These wandering intellectuals were the antithesis of the secluded monk. Their lives were defined by movement and adaptation. A typical journey might begin with a scholar, perhaps a master from a nascent urban school, deciding that the audience in his current city was too small, too hostile, or simply unable to support him. He would gather his few belongings, his most important texts, a wax tablet for notes, a sharp stylus, and perhaps a letter of introduction from a previous patron, and set out. His survival depended on a delicate medieval economy of knowledge and patronage. Upon arriving in a new town, he would need to seek an audience with the local bishop, abbot, or lord. His pitch was not for a salary, but for protection, a place to sleep, and perhaps a meal in exchange for his services. A nobleman might value the prestige of hosting a learned man who could tutor his children, engage in stimulating debate, or even offer practical advice based on classical texts on governance or agriculture. A religious leader might be interested in his expertise in theology or canon law. In this way, knowledge became a currency traded for basic sustenance and safety. The impact of this constant circulation of people and ideas cannot be overstated. It created a dynamic, living web of intellectual exchange that prevented learning from becoming stagnant or provincial. A philosophical concept debated in the schools of Paris could, within a few months, be discussed in the market squares of Germany because a teacher who had been there carried it with him. A new method of musical notation developed in one monastery could be shared with another 100 miles away by a scholar who had copied it down. This mobility was a powerful antidote to isolation. It meant that a brilliant student born in a remote village wasn't necessarily cut off from the great intellectual currents of their time. If they were lucky, the currents might just come to them in the form of a traveling master. These teachers were the human hyperlinks of their day, connecting nodes of knowledge across a continent and ensuring that the flame of inquiry was not just kept burning in one place, but carried like a torch to ignite new fires everywhere they went. Their legacy is the very model of interconnectedness, proving that sometimes the most powerful educational institution is not a building at all, but a well-worn path. Meanwhile, far to the east, a brilliant intellectual dawn was breaking, one that would ultimately provide the lifeline for European thought. As the Latin West struggled through its so-called Dark Ages, the vast and sophisticated Islamic Caliphate, stretching from Spain to the borders of India, entered an era of unprecedented cultural and scientific flourishing known as the Islamic Golden Age. This was not an isolated phenomenon but a conscious, state-sponsored project of intellectual synthesis. Caliphs and sultans, acting as the great patrons of this movement, actively sought out knowledge from every corner of the known world, understanding that political and cultural power was inextricably linked to intellectual mastery. They established massive libraries and research institutions that became the engines of this renaissance, places where scholars of different faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and others, could work side by side, united by a common pursuit of wisdom rather than divided by dogma. This environment of open inquiry and generous funding created the perfect conditions for a spectacular cross-pollination of ideas that would reshape the global intellectual landscape. The crown jewel of this endeavor was undoubtedly the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, established in Baghdad by the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th century. Imagine a campus unlike any other, a buzzing, vibrant academy that was part library, part translation bureau, part research institute, and part university. Its primary mission was one of breathtaking ambition: to seek out, translate, and critically engage with the entire body of the world's knowledge. Agents were sent far and wide to acquire precious manuscripts. A single caravan might return with mathematical treatises from India, medical texts from Persia, and philosophical works from the crumbling libraries of the Byzantine Empire. Within the House of Wisdom, teams of translators, often working in pairs, a native speaker of Greek or Syriac, would dictate the translation to an Arabic scribe, undertook the monumental task of rendering these works into Arabic. But they did far more than simply translate. They annotated, criticized, corrected, and expanded upon the originals. A translated text by the Greek physician Galen would be accompanied by voluminous commentaries from Islamic scholars, noting where their own observations and experiments confirmed or contradicted the ancient master. This critical engagement transformed preservation into active innovation. The list of ancient thinkers given a new lease on life through this process reads like a who's who of classical learning. The logical works of Aristotle, the idealistic philosophy of Plato, the geometric proofs of Euclid, the medical theories of Hippocrates, the astronomical models of Ptolemy, all of these were meticulously translated, studied, and debated. Without this Arabic intervention, many of these foundational texts would have been lost to the West forever, their original Greek versions having decayed or been destroyed. But the scholars of the Islamic world were not merely passive librarians guarding a dusty inheritance. They used these ancient foundations as a springboard for breathtaking original contributions. The Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi systematized algebra, a word derived from the title of his book, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a 1,000,000-word encyclopedia that became the standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries. The physicist Ibn al-Haytham pioneered the modern scientific method through his rigorous experiments on optics, overturning centuries of Greek speculation with empirical evidence. This vast repository of enriched knowledge eventually made its way back to a Europe that was just beginning to stir from its long intellectual slumber. The primary point of contact was in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain, a land of remarkable coexistence where cities like Cordoba and Toledo became bustling marketplaces of ideas. As Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered these territories, they found vast libraries filled with Arabic texts containing wisdom both ancient and new. Eager scholars from across Europe flocked to translation schools in Toledo, where teams much like those in the original House of Wisdom now worked in reverse, translating these Arabic works into Latin. Suddenly, European scholars discovered that Aristotle was far more complex than they had previously known, that the world was round and its circumference had been calculated with stunning accuracy by Islamic astronomers, and that advanced mathematics could solve problems that had baffled them for generations. The Islamic world had acted as the essential bridge across the dark chasm of centuries, carefully carrying the torch of antiquity, fueling it with their own brilliant innovations, and finally handing it back to a grateful and revitalized West, setting the stage for the European Renaissance. Yet, even as these individual networks of knowledge grew, a singular figure emerged in the heart of Europe who understood that intellectual revival required more than isolated effort. It demanded a unified, empire-wide strategy. Charlemagne, the towering king of the Franks crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800, was a warrior and a statesman, but he was also a man haunted by the illiteracy of his own court. The story goes that he himself struggled to write, often keeping wax tablets beneath his pillow to practice his letters late into the night. This personal frustration blossomed into a profound imperial vision. He recognized that to govern a vast, sprawling empire stretching from modern-day France to Germany and Italy, he needed a competent, educated administration, clerics who could draft accurate decrees, judges who could understand complex laws, and diplomats who could communicate with a unified voice. Out of this practical need was born the Carolingian Renaissance, a brilliant, if brief, flash of organized light in what was still a very dark age. Charlemagne's method was not to build universities but to repurpose and reinforce the existing structures of his realm, transforming them into a coherent system. His most famous act was to attract the finest scholarly mind of the age to his court at Aachen, Alcuin of York, a renowned teacher from the thriving school in England. With Alcuin as his chief advisor on educational matters, Charlemagne launched a cultural revolution through a series of royal decrees known as capitularies. The most famous of these, the Admonitio Generalis issued in 789, ordered that every monastery and cathedral throughout the empire establish schools to instruct boys not only in the religious faith but in the liberal arts, the foundational trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. For the first time in centuries, there was a centralized royal command to educate, creating a network of linked learning centers that answered to the emperor's directive. The palace school at Aachen became the glittering model for this new standard. This was not a school for the masses. It was an elite training ground for the sons of nobles and the most promising young minds from across the empire, including Charlemagne's own children. Here, under Alcuin's guidance, students engaged in a curriculum that blended sacred and secular knowledge. They studied the Bible and the Church Fathers, but they also read the classical Latin authors like Virgil and Cicero and debated the principles of philosophy. The atmosphere was intentionally modeled on the conversational, questioning style of the ancient academies, with Charlemagne himself often participating in these learned discussions, asking probing questions and delighting in the intellectual exchange. This sent a powerful message. Knowledge was not just for monks in secluded cloisters. It was a vital tool for leadership and a worthy pursuit for the highest echelons of power. Perhaps the most enduring and visible legacy of this Renaissance was the radical standardization of the written word. Before Charlemagne's reforms, written Latin had deteriorated into a confusing array of regional scripts that were often barely legible to someone from another part of the empire. A document written in northern France might look completely different from one penned in Lombardy, hindering administration and the spread of ideas. In response, scribes at the court school developed a new, clear, and elegant script known as Carolingian minuscule. It featured neat, rounded letters, distinct upper and lower cases, and consistent spacing between words, a revolutionary innovation that dramatically improved readability. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a political and intellectual tool. The emperor decreed that this new script be used for all official documents and for copying texts, ensuring clarity and uniformity across his vast domains. Centuries later, when Italian Renaissance scholars sought to recover classical texts, they found that the oldest and most reliable copies were often those written in this clean Carolingian hand, and they mistakenly believed it was the original script of the Romans. So taken were they by its clarity that they adopted it as their own, and it eventually evolved into the standard typefaces we use in print today. The brief flicker of the Carolingian Renaissance thus left a permanent mark on how the entire Western world would read and write, proving that a coordinated vision, even one that lasts only a few generations, can create a foundation that supports 1,000 years of future advancement. Yet the thirst for a more structured and advanced education could not be satisfied by wandering masters or even the palace schools of emperors alone. A new, more permanent anchor for learning was needed, and it began to take shape in the very heart of medieval cities, rising not from imperial decrees but from the ambitions of the church itself. Attached to the great cathedrals that were becoming the skylines of Europe, a new kind of school began to emerge, one that offered a powerful combination of stability, prestige, and a curriculum that reached beyond the basics of reading and writing for monks. These cathedral schools, flourishing from the 10th century onward, became the crucial breeding grounds for the intellectual class that would eventually build the first universities. They were the vital missing link, the institutional prototype that blended the sacred mission of the monastery with the worldly needs of a growing society. Imagine the scene in a city like Chartres, Reims, or Paris. The cathedral itself is the center of civic life, a monumental project that might take 100 years to build, swarming with masons, glaziers, and craftsmen. In a quieter corner of this vast complex, perhaps in a dedicated hall or even within the cloister, a small group of students gathers around a single master. This master is not a wandering scholar seeking a meal and a roof for the night. He is a canon, a high-ranking cleric appointed by the bishop specifically for his profound learning. His position is official and salaried, meaning he can focus entirely on teaching without the constant worry of finding his next patron. This simple shift from itinerant intellectual to resident professional was a revolution in itself. It provided the consistent presence necessary for a sustained and progressive course of study. Students, no longer just young oblates destined for the monastery, now included the sons of nobles and wealthy merchants, all seeking the advantages that a superior education could bring: careers in the church's vast administration, roles as advisors to kings, or simply the social prestige of being a learned man. The curriculum at these schools was a deliberate and powerful fusion of the divine and the human, the sacred and the secular. At its core was the study of the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, was the foundation. Grammar meant far more than just memorizing Latin conjugations. It was the key to unlocking the profound beauty and meaning in the texts of the Church Fathers and the classical authors. Rhetoric was the art of persuasive speaking and writing, essential for any aspiring preacher, lawyer, or diplomat. Logic, or dialectic, was the crown jewel of the trivium, the sharp tool of reason used to analyze complex theological questions and defend the faith against heresy. For those who advanced, the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy awaited. This was not merely practical training. Arithmetic was needed to calculate the movable feast of Easter. Geometry could reveal the divine proportions in the architecture of the cathedral itself. Music was the mathematical study of harmony, essential for the complex chants of the liturgy. Astronomy was crucial for creating the church calendar and understanding God's orderly cosmos. This integrated curriculum taught students that all knowledge, whether from the Bible or from the pagan philosophers, was ultimately a path to understanding God's creation, making the pursuit of secular learning a fundamentally religious act. What truly set the cathedral schools apart and made them the direct precursors to universities was the scholarly community they nurtured. Unlike the isolated monk in his scriptorium or the lone student apprenticed to a single master, the cathedral school created a critical mass of intellect. A famous master like Fulbert at Chartres or Anselm at Laon could attract dozens, even hundreds of students from all over Europe. These young men lived together in boarding houses, debated each other in the courtyards, and formed a distinct social group with its own identity and ambitions. They were no longer passive recipients of knowledge but active participants in a living intellectual culture. This dense clustering of teachers and students created the perfect conditions for the next evolutionary leap. When these students, now educated to a high level, began to demand more rights, when masters began to organize themselves into guilds to protect their interests and standardize qualifications, the seeds of the university were sown. The cathedral school provided the stable soil, the rich curriculum, and the vibrant community from which those seeds could sprout, transforming the informal network of the invisible university into the formal, powerful institutions that would dominate learning for centuries to come. Yet for all the brilliance of individual scholars and the stability of cathedral schools, none of it could have flourished without fuel, and that fuel was wealth. In a world without government grants or public funding for education, the entire intellectual ecosystem of the Middle Ages depended on a very personal and often precarious system: the generosity of the powerful. This was the engine of patronage, a complex exchange between those who had material resources and those who possessed intellectual gifts. Picture a medieval king surrounded by the trappings of power, lands, armies, castles. But to secure a legacy that would outlast his reign, he needed more than military might. He needed cultural capital. By sponsoring a renowned scholar, commissioning a lavishly illuminated Bible, or endowing a school, he wasn't just giving away gold. He was investing in his own immortality. transforming earthly wealth into eternal prestige and crafting a reputation for piety and wisdom that would be remembered long after his battles were forgotten. A patron's name, meticulously inscribed in the dedication of a priceless manuscript or etched into the foundation stone of a collegiate library, became permanently woven into the fabric of cultural memory, a silent partner in every discovery and every lesson taught. The forms this support took were as varied as the patrons themselves. For a queen like Helena of Aquitaine, patronage might mean providing a safe haven and a steady income for a troubadour or poet at her court, enriching the cultural life around her and shaping the very ideals of chivalry and romance. For a powerful bishop, it could mean using the vast resources of his diocese to fund a scriptorium, ensuring the production of liturgical books and the training of scribes who could also serve the administrative needs of the church. For a nobleman, it might be a simple but crucial act, offering room and board to a wandering scholar in exchange for tutoring his children, thereby elevating the next generation of his family with the gift of literacy and learning. This system was beautifully and necessarily symbiotic. The scholar received the means to live and work, free from the grinding poverty that would otherwise force them to abandon their studies for manual labor. In return, the patron received tangible and intangible rewards. They gained access to expert advisors who could draft legal documents, manage accounts, or provide counsel on matters of statecraft based on classical principles. They enjoyed the reflected glory of being associated with groundbreaking work, their court becoming known as a center of sophistication and learning. And on a deeper level, they fulfilled a profound religious and social duty, the act of charity seen as a virtuous deed that benefited their soul and contributed to the greater good of Christendom. This relationship, however, was far from a simple transaction. It was a delicate dance with its own unspoken rules and potential pitfalls. A scholar's work always existed in the shadow of their patron's preferences and doctrinal boundaries. The question of what was worthy of patronage was never far from what was considered orthodox or politically expedient. A thinker exploring ideas that challenged church doctrine or threatened the social order could quickly find their funding withdrawn and their safety in jeopardy. The patron held the power, and the intellectual's freedom to inquire was always conditional on their alignment with the patron's goals. Yet, within those constraints, incredible things were achieved. It was royal patronage that established the great translation schools in Toledo, bringing the wealth of Arabic knowledge into Latin Europe. It was papal patronage that supported the work of theologians like Thomas Aquinas, whose synthesis of faith and reason would become a cornerstone of Catholic thought. This system, for all its flaws, was the essential scaffolding upon which the invisible university was built, proving that the pursuit of knowledge has always required not just brilliant minds, but also the foresight and generosity of those willing to bet on a future they themselves might not live to see. However, in a world where books were rare treasures and certain ideas could be deemed dangerous, simply writing something down was not enough. It had to be written in a way that would only reveal its true meaning to the right eyes. This gave rise to a fascinating and pervasive practice, the art of encoding wisdom within layers of symbolism, allegory, and outright deception. For many medieval thinkers, a text was not a transparent window into an idea but a locked box, and the key was reserved for those who had done the work to deserve it. This wasn't about being secretive for its own sake. It was a sophisticated strategy for survival, a radical philosophical concept, or a potentially volatile scientific observation, if stated too plainly, could attract the wrath of religious authorities or powerful patrons. By cloaking these ideas in the rich tapestry of myth, biblical allegory, and complex imagery, A scholar could share their insights with a trusted circle of initiates while presenting an innocuous or even pious face to the outside world. Nowhere was this practice more elaborate than in the world of alchemy. To the uninitiated, an alchemical manuscript looks like a fantastical storybook. It is filled with vivid illustrations of kings and queens marrying, dragons swallowing the sun, green lions devouring the moon, and Ouroboros serpents eating their own tails. An untrained reader might dismiss it as superstition or madness, but for the adept, every one of these images was a precise, technical term in a coded chemical language. The chemical wedding of the king and queen was not a fairy tale but a metaphor for the combination of sulfur and mercury, the fundamental principles of metals. The green lion often referred to sulfuric acid, a powerful agent that could dissolve many materials. This symbolic language served multiple purposes. It protected the alchemist from accusations of heresy or witchcraft, as their work could be passed off as spiritual allegory. It also protected their practical, economic secrets. The steps to creating a vibrant pigment or a potent medicine were valuable intellectual property. Most profoundly, it enforced a moral and intellectual filter. If you were not patient, humble, and wise enough to learn the symbolic keys, you would never unlock the practical secrets. This ensured that powerful knowledge did not fall into the hands of those who would use it for greed or destruction, turning the pursuit of learning into a test of character as much as intellect. This culture of layered reading extended far beyond the laboratory. Theologians and philosophers mastered the art of writing texts that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. A great work of medieval literature or philosophy could be read literally for its surface narrative, allegorically for its symbolic moral meaning, tropologically for its ethical instructions on how to live, and anagogically for its mystical insights into the divine. A text like Dante's Divine Comedy is the ultimate expression of this, a work that functions as a thrilling travelogue through the afterlife, a sharp political satire of his contemporaries, a profound theological treatise, and a guide to personal salvation all at once. This approach demanded an active, discerning reader. The consumer of knowledge was not a passive vessel to be filled but a detective, an excavator, and a co-creator of meaning. The scholar's goal was not to make understanding easy, but to make it earned. This deep, strenuous engagement was seen as the only path to true wisdom, which was not a commodity to be possessed but a state of being achieved through a lifelong process of seeking, questioning, and interpreting. This tradition of esoteric communication created a unique intellectual kinship across time and space. A scholar in 14th century England, decoding the cryptic verses of an ancient Greek text that had been preserved by Islamic philosophers and translated in a Spanish monastery, was participating in a grand, centuries-long conversation. They were part of a hidden fellowship of the mind, a chain of thinkers who understood that the most valuable truths are often too potent to be left in the open. They must be buried like treasure so that only those with the right map, a map drawn not on parchment but through study, contemplation, and a purified intention, can ever hope to find them. In this way, the Invisible University was not just a network of people and places, but a state of mind, a shared commitment to protecting the flame of inquiry by sometimes hiding it within a lantern, allowing its light to shine only for those who knew how to see. Just when the fragile networks of medieval learning began to find their footing, the 14th century delivered a cataclysm that threatened to erase everything. The Black Death did not merely disrupt the Invisible University, it seemed intent on obliterating it entirely. Arriving in Europe in 1347, This devastating pandemic wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of the continent's population in just a few horrific years. The impact on the world of knowledge was immediate and brutal. Imagine the scene in a bustling urban cathedral school or a renowned monastic scriptorium. One day, the room is filled with the low murmur of debate and the scratch of quills. The next, a third of the scholars and scribes are dead, their wisdom and skills lost forever in a matter of days. Patrons, the kings, nobles, and bishops who funded manuscripts and supported teachers, succumbed to the plague in droves, their wealth and protection vanishing overnight. The intricate web of personal connections that allowed a wandering scholar to find shelter or a master to attract students was torn apart, leaving isolated individuals stranded in a landscape of overwhelming death and despair. It was the single greatest threat the Knowledge Preservation Project had ever faced. Yet, in the face of this existential crisis, the very informality and decentralization of the invisible university became its greatest strength. With central hubs like major cities and cathedral schools decimated, the work of preservation was pushed to the margins, into the remote and often overlooked corners of society. Small, isolated rural monasteries, which had always been part of the network but were far from its bustling centers, suddenly found themselves as unexpected arcs of learning. Sheltered by their remoteness, some of these communities were spared the worst of the plague. The monks within redoubled their efforts, understanding the profound responsibility that had fallen to them. A single scribe, perhaps the only one left in his region who could expertly handle a quill, might work in near-total isolation, copying texts not for a grand library, but simply to ensure that the knowledge within them did not die with him. These solitary acts of dedication, happening in hidden valleys and on windswept hills, became tiny, flickering lights holding out against a vast darkness. Without the pressure of patrons or the distractions of a scholarly community, their work became more personal, more focused on the core mission of sheer survival for the texts themselves. The plague also catalyzed a dramatic and pragmatic shift in how knowledge was transmitted. With so many teachers dead, those who remained had to develop new methods to reach a diminished and scattered student body. The traditional model of gathering a circle of students for oral lectures became dangerously impractical. This forced innovation led to an explosion in the production of teaching aids and summaries, concise, clearly written compendiums of knowledge that a student could study with minimal guidance. These texts were designed for resilience, packing the essentials of a subject into a portable and durable format. Furthermore, the sheer scale of death created a strange social upheaval. The scarcity of labor after the plague empowered the survivors, including those with education. A moderately educated priest or scribe might find their skills in higher demand than ever before, allowing them to negotiate for better conditions and greater independence. This subtle shift began to weaken the rigid feudal and ecclesiastical structures, creating small cracks through which a new, more individualized spirit of inquiry would eventually grow. The catastrophe, in a terrible, roundabout way, forced the system to become more efficient, more portable, and in some ways more accessible. This pattern of collapse and adaptation wasn't unique to the plague. It was the recurring rhythm of the medieval era. Continuous wars, famines, and local conflicts routinely shattered communities and scattered knowledge keepers. A monastery on a contested border might be looted and burned, its library destroyed not by disease but by soldiers. A patron family might be wiped out in a feudal dispute, ending their generation's long support of a particular school or scholar. Each time, the response was the same, a desperate, ingenious scramble to adapt. Knowledge would be hidden away in chests and buried for safekeeping. Precious manuscripts would be broken apart and smuggled to safety in separate bundles. Teachers would adopt disguises and take to the roads carrying their lessons in their heads. The constant threat of loss taught medieval scholars to never put all their eggs in one basket. They became masters of redundancy, copying texts in multiple locations and ensuring that key ideas were preserved in more than one memory, more than one library, more than one region. This distributed model of knowledge storage, born from necessity, is what ultimately ensured that no single disaster could deliver a fatal blow. The resilience of the invisible university was not found in its strength, but in its lack of a single point of failure. It was a web that could lose many threads and still hold its shape, proving that the most fragile-looking networks can sometimes be the hardest to break. While the Scriptoria and Cathedral schools formed the stationary heart of the invisible university, its lifeblood flowed along the vast, sprawling network of medieval trade routes. Picture a caravan of camels and merchants snaking its way across the arid landscapes of Central Asia, their saddlebags bursting not just with silks and spices, but with something far more precious and intangible: ideas. These merchants were the unsung diplomats of the intellect, often unaware that the casual conversations they had at a caravanserai or the curious books they carried as gifts were quietly reshaping the world of knowledge. A Persian merchant might share a new navigational technique learned from an Indian sailor with a scholar he met in Baghdad. A Byzantine diplomat traveling to negotiate a trade agreement might carry in his luggage a copy of a Greek philosophical text, a treasure long lost to the West but preserved in an Eastern library. These routes, especially the legendary Silk Road, functioned as the internet of the medieval world, a slow, physical, but astonishingly effective system for the cross-continental transmission of culture, science, and innovation. The goods that moved along these routes often served as the perfect Trojan horses for new concepts. The arrival of paper from China into the Islamic world and later into Europe is a perfect example. This wasn't just a new writing material, it was a revolutionary information technology. Compared to the expensive and heavy parchment made from animal skins, paper was cheaper, lighter, and faster to produce. Its adoption didn't just make books more affordable, it fundamentally changed the scale on which knowledge could be reproduced and distributed. A scholar could now own multiple books, take notes freely, and correspond with colleagues across great distances without incurring a fortune in material costs. This technological shift, facilitated entirely by trade, supercharged the efforts of scribes and scholars, allowing the invisible university to expand its reach exponentially. Similarly, the intricate astrolabes crafted by Muslim artisans, used for navigation and solving astronomical problems, found their way into European hands through trade. The device itself was a marvel, but with it came a deep understanding of spherical trigonometry and celestial mechanics, forcing European scholars to engage with and master advanced mathematical concepts from the East. Perhaps the most profound exchanges occurred in the realm of medicine and mathematics. Through the constant movement of people along trade routes, medical knowledge from the great hospital centers of the Middle East, like those in Cairo and Damascus, began to filter into Europe. Texts by physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, which synthesized Greek knowledge with original discoveries and practices from as far away as India, were translated and studied, introducing more systematic approaches to diagnosis, surgery, and pharmacology. In mathematics, the most famous gift was the set of numerals we use today. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, with its game-changing concept of the zero and place value, traveled from India to the Islamic world and was then introduced to Europe largely through the commercial activities of Italian merchants like Leonardo of Pisa, also known as Fibonacci. In his book Liber Abbessi, written in 1202, He passionately advocated for this new system by demonstrating its overwhelming advantages for bookkeeping, currency exchange, and calculating profit margins, the very practical needs of traders. The abacus-based calculations of the Roman numeral system were no match for the efficiency of this new method, and its adoption by the commercial world eventually forced the scholarly world to take notice and embrace it, revolutionizing European mathematics and science. This global conversation was rarely a formal, organized exchange, but rather a slow, organic process of osmosis. It happened in the multilingual ports of the Mediterranean, where ship captains compared maps and shared stories of distant lands, subtly correcting and expanding the geographical understanding of the world. It happened in the market squares where a traveling physician from Persia might demonstrate a new surgical technique to a local barber surgeon. It happened when a European scholar, seeking a rare text, discovered that the only copy available was in Arabic, sparking a desperate and ultimately fruitful search for a translator. Trade provided the pretext for these encounters, creating the neutral ground where practical necessity overcame cultural and linguistic barriers. The merchant primary goal was profit, but in pursuing that goal, they became the essential couriers of the intellect, weaving a dense, informal, and incredibly resilient global knowledge network that ensured no great discovery, no matter where it originated, would remain isolated for long. For centuries, Latin reigned supreme as the exclusive language of learning, a sacred code understood only by the clergy and a sliver of the educated aristocracy. This created a powerful intellectual monopoly where profound ideas about philosophy, law, medicine, and the natural world were locked away behind a linguistic barrier as formidable as any castle wall. To be unlettered in Latin was to be shut out from the great conversation of humankind, condemned to receive knowledge only through the filtered interpretations of a priestly class. But a quiet revolution was brewing not in the silent scriptoria, but in the bustling market squares, royal courts, and growing urban centers of Europe. There, a powerful demand was growing among merchants, skilled artisans, and the lower nobility, a class growing in wealth and confidence for access to the very knowledge that defined power and prestige. They wanted to read for themselves, to understand the laws that governed them, the stars that guided their ships, and the philosophies that shaped their world. This hunger for direct engagement could no longer be satisfied by Latin alone. It demanded a key to unlock the vault, and that key was translation into the vernacular, the living, breathing languages of everyday life. This movement to translate the great texts of the age into languages like English, French, Italian, and German was nothing short of a radical act of democratization. It was a deliberate dismantling of the gatekeeper's power. Pioneering figures took enormous personal risks to make this happen. In 14th century England, the theologian and reformer John Wycliffe and his followers embarked on the monumental task of translating the entire Bible from Latin into Middle English. Their goal was audacious: to place the most important text in Christendom directly into the hands of the plowman and the baker, allowing them to encounter Scripture without the mandatory mediation of a Latin-speaking priest. The ecclesiastical authorities were horrified, seeing it as a direct threat to their control over doctrine and interpretation. Wycliffe was condemned as a heretic and his followers were persecuted, yet their translated manuscripts, known as Wycliffe Bibles, were copied and circulated secretly, read aloud in homes and fields, creating a new, intimate relationship with faith and knowledge that bypassed traditional institutions entirely. The impact extended far beyond religious texts. Across the continent, patrons began commissioning translations of practical and philosophical works. A wealthy Italian merchant with no classical education, might still want to understand the principles of geometry to improve his accounting, or the teachings of ancient historians to better grasp statecraft. In response, translators rendered Euclid's geometric proofs and Livy's histories of Rome into vibrant Italian. In France, manuals on surgery and medicine were translated from Latin and even Arabic into French, putting life-saving knowledge into the hands of barber surgeons and midwives who had never set foot in a university. This was the birth of a truly popular Enlightenment, where expertise was no longer the sole property of an ordained elite. A clever woman with a head for business could now read a translated legal text and better understand her rights in a contract. An inventive craftsman could study translated diagrams of ancient engines and be inspired to create new technologies. By breaking the linguistic monopoly, the Invisible University expanded its membership exponentially, welcoming in a whole new class of thinkers, tinkerers, and innovators who would fuel the progress of the coming centuries. The act of translation was more than just changing words. It was an act of empowerment, declaring that the treasures of knowledge belonged not to a select few, but to all of humanity. Yet for all the grand networks of trade and translation, some of the most vital knowledge was never written down in any language. It was carried in the hands, the memories, and the daily practices of women who operated almost entirely outside the formal systems of learning. While the story of medieval scholarship often focuses on the great male thinkers in monasteries and universities, a parallel and equally essential narrative was unfolding in the home, the garden, the convent, and the village square. Here, women served as the unsung archivists of practical wisdom, preserving a vast repository of knowledge that was crucial for survival, health, and cultural continuity. Their contributions, though frequently omitted from official histories, formed a foundational layer of the Invisible University, one deeply rooted in the necessities of everyday life. Consider the role of the laywoman, the majority of whom would never learn to read Latin or even their own vernacular. Their education was not found in books but in observation, apprenticeship, and oral tradition passed from mother to daughter, mistress to apprentice, healer to novice. This was a hands-on curriculum of immense practical value. A woman might be the sole keeper of knowledge about which local herbs could reduce a fever, which poultices could heal a wound, or which plants could be safely used for dyeing textiles. Midwifery, a field almost entirely dominated by women, was a sophisticated science built on generations of accumulated experience about childbirth, prenatal care, and infant health. This was not guesswork, it was empirical knowledge tested and refined over centuries. These women were the community's first responders, its pharmacists and its therapists, holding a library of practical solutions in their heads. Their work ensured that even when learned physicians were unavailable or unaffordable, a body of effective, time-tested knowledge remained accessible to all, from the poorest peasant to the noblewoman in her chamber. Within the walls of convents, women found a unique space that offered both spiritual sanctuary and unprecedented intellectual freedom. As abbesses of powerful religious communities, women could wield authority that was often denied to them in the secular world. These convents became flourishing centers of female learning, their scriptoria every bit as active and important as those in male monasteries. An abbess like Hildegard of Bingen was not an isolated anomaly but a shining example of what was possible within this system. In her Rhineland convent, Hildegard functioned as a polymath, a composer creating some of the most complex and beautiful sacred music of the age, a theologian recording her elaborate mystical visions, a naturalist authoring detailed scientific works on medicine and the natural world, and a correspondent who advised popes, emperors, and kings. Her masterwork, Physica, was a comprehensive encyclopedia of natural science that detailed the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, stones, and animals, blending classical learning with her own sharp observations. Her achievements were monumental, but they were made possible by the structure of the convent, which provided her with the resources, the audience, and the sanctioned authority to pursue her intellectual passions. Beyond these famous examples, noblewomen played a crucial role as patrons and facilitators, using their wealth and social standing to bankroll the work of others. A duchess or queen might commission the translation of an important text into the vernacular, not for her own use but to make it available to a wider audience. She might provide a permanent home and a steady income for a scholar, allowing him to focus on his writing without the constant need to wander. In some cases, these women were far more than passive benefactors. They were active participants in the intellectual life of their courts, hosting salons where poetry was read, philosophical ideas were debated, and new works were presented. By creating these vibrant cultural environments, they acted as the glue that connected isolated thinkers, fostering the kind of collaborative exchange that fuels innovation. Their patronage was a quiet, strategic investment in the intellectual capital of their time, ensuring that the work of preservation and creation could continue under their protection and with their encouragement. The legacy of these countless women, from the anonymous village healer to the visionary abbess, is a testament to the many forms that knowledge can take. They remind us that the great edifice of learning is not built by philosophers alone. It is also built on the foundation of practical skill, on oral history, on intimate care, and on the courageous act of creating space for inquiry wherever one can find it. By operating both within the limited formal structures available to them and inventing their own informal networks entirely outside of them, women did not just preserve knowledge, they fundamentally enriched it. They brought different questions, different experiences, and different perspectives to the great challenges of their time, ensuring that the invisible university was not a monologue delivered by a privileged few, but a rich, complex, and truly collective conversation. The very word lecture carries with it the weight of centuries, a term derived from the Latin lectura, meaning a reading. And in its earliest medieval form, that is precisely what it was. Picture the scene long before any university hall was built, a small group of students huddled around a single master, who holds the only copy of a precious text, perhaps a work by Aristotle or a commentary on canon law. The master's primary task was not to offer original insights, but to perform the text, to read it aloud clearly and slowly so that the students who had no copy of their own could frantically try to capture every word. They would use a stylus to etch the master's words onto wax tablets, creating a temporary, erasable record that they could later use to create a more permanent manuscript for themselves. This act of reading was the foundational act of teaching, a direct and vital transmission of knowledge that was otherwise locked away in a single, fragile book. The lecture began not as a performance of a teacher's genius, but as an act of communal sharing, a necessary solution to the profound scarcity of the written word. But this simple reading was only the beginning. Once the text had been delivered, the true intellectual work would commence in the form of the Disputatio, or Disputation. The master would then offer his commentary, unpacking the dense, often cryptic language of the ancient authority. He might explain obscure references, clarify contradictions, and pose questions that the text left unanswered. This was where the master's own expertise shone, transforming a passive reading into an active, critical engagement with the material. The students, now armed with their wax tablet notes, would then be expected to respond, to challenge the master's interpretations, and to debate each other. A lecture was therefore not a one-way monologue but a dynamic, Socratic dialogue. It was a noisy, participatory, and often heated affair where knowledge was not merely received but tested, stretched, and solidified through rigorous argument. This combination of lectio reading and disputatio debate formed the core of the medieval pedagogical method, a powerful one-two punch that ensured students didn't just hear information, they learned how to think with it, question it, and defend it. As the demand for education grew in the 12th and 13th centuries, this informal gathering evolved into a more formalized and efficient institution. The master, now a licensed professional often affiliated with an emerging university guild, would announce the time and place of his lectures. Instead of a private room, he might rent a large hall or simply use a public space, attracting dozens, sometimes hundreds, of students from all across Europe. The format became more structured to manage these larger crowds. The master would often be elevated on a platform or cathedra, the chair from which we get the word cathedral, so his voice could carry further. His reading and commentary became more organized, often following a standard set of steps, stating the topic, outlining the key questions, presenting authoritative opinions, arguing for his own resolution, and finally, refuting potential objections. This structure provided a clear mental scaffold for students, helping them to organize the vast amounts of information being presented. The technology of note-taking evolved alongside these developments. The wax tablet gave way to the more permanent and capacious parchment notebook, known as a picia. Stationers near the university centers would rent out sections or picii of a standard text, which students could then copy into their own notebooks to build their personal libraries over time. This system allowed for a more accurate and widespread distribution of knowledge. The student was no longer just a scribe trying to capture every word in the moment. They could now listen more attentively to the master's commentary, jotting down key insights and arguments while knowing the core text was available for reference later. This shift marked a crucial move from pure transcription to active listening and synthesis, a cognitive leap that is at the very heart of modern education. The medieval lecture, born from necessity in an age without books, had refined itself into a sophisticated and scalable engine for mass education, proving that the most enduring pedagogical innovations often arise from the simplest need to share what we know. If the medieval lecture was the method for transferring established knowledge, then the disputation was the forge where new understanding was hammered out and tested for its strength. This was not a casual exchange of opinions but a highly formalized, almost theatrical event that stood at the very heart of scholarly life. Imagine the atmosphere, a packed hall, the air thick with anticipation as a master, having posed a complex question like, can God's existence be proven by reason alone? Would appoint his most brilliant student to defend a daring and often controversial thesis. This respondent would then have to withstand a relentless, logical assault from the entire assembly of scholars and fellow students, all trained to find the slightest flaw in his argument. This was intellectual combat, governed by strict rules of logic and rhetoric, where the goal was not to humiliate an opponent but to collectively pressure test an idea until only the most resilient truths remained standing. The structure of a formal disputation followed a precise, almost mathematical pattern, designed to eliminate emotional bias and focus purely on the power of the argument. It began with the presentation of the initial question, always framed to invite multiple, conflicting answers from authoritative sources. The respondent would then systematically build his case, citing approved texts from the Bible, the Church Fathers, and ancient philosophers like Aristotle to support his position. Next came the opposition, where objectors would rise one by one to present powerful counter-arguments, each also backed by a formidable array of authoritative quotes. The respondent had to listen intently to each objection, remember it perfectly, and then methodically refute them all in order without notes or hesitation. This required not just a vast memory, but incredible mental agility, composure, and a deep understanding of logic to dismantle the objections while consistently reinforcing his own central thesis. The entire process was a public demonstration of intellectual mastery, where a scholar's reputation could be made or broken based on their performance in this high-stakes arena of ideas. Far from being a dry academic exercise, this culture of rigorous debate was the engine of progress within the invisible university. It instilled a habit of critical thinking that prevented knowledge from becoming stagnant dogma. When every proposition, no matter how seemingly obvious, was subject to intense scrutiny, it forced scholars to refine their ideas, anticipate objections, and build more robust and defensible theories. This process acted as a natural filter for error and sloppy thinking. A weak or poorly reasoned idea would be quickly exposed and discarded under the relentless questioning of peers, while a strong one would emerge from the ordeal tempered and strengthened, its validity confirmed by its ability to survive the toughest possible challenge. Disputation taught that truth was not a fragile artifact to be protected in a glass case, but a living, dynamic thing that could only be discovered and validated through the clash of opposing viewpoints. It was a system that thrived on dissent, understanding that the friction of debate was necessary to generate the light of understanding. This commitment to a communal, critical method of inquiry is perhaps the most enduring gift of medieval scholarship to the modern world, forming the bedrock of the scientific method and all rigorous academic discourse that followed. But for all the intellectual energy of the public lecture halls and the structured debates, some of the most precious treasures of the medieval world remained hidden from view, tucked away in the private chambers of nobles, the locked chests of wealthy merchants, and the humble studies of independent scholars. These were the hidden libraries, personal collections painstakingly built over a lifetime, and they represented a deeply personal and often secretive form of knowledge preservation. Unlike the institutional monastic library, which was curated for the spiritual and intellectual needs of a community, a private library was a reflection of one individual's passions, ambitions, and curiosities. It could contain anything from a beautifully illuminated book of hours for personal devotion to a forbidden text on astrology or alchemy, from a practical manual on estate management to a rare translated copy of an ancient Greek philosophical dialogue. These collections were not assembled by committee, they were acts of love, and each volume told a story not just through its words, but through the journey it had taken to end up in that specific room, in that specific chest, under the care of that specific person. The process of building such a library was a monumental and expensive undertaking, a testament to the owner's wealth, connections, and sheer determination. A nobleman might commission a specific text directly from a monastic scriptorium, paying a small fortune for the materials and the scribe's time. A merchant with trading contacts in the East might acquire a stunning Arabic scientific manuscript as an exotic luxury item, a symbol of his worldliness and sophistication. Scholars, often living on the edge of poverty, might trade their own services as tutors or translators for the chance to copy a coveted text, slowly and laboriously building their personal repository word by word. Each book was a significant investment, not just of money but of social capital, acquired through a complex web of favors, patronage, and sometimes outright subterfuge. The result was a library that was uniquely tailored, a physical manifestation of its owner's intellectual identity, holding works that a more conservative monastic library might have deemed too controversial, too secular, or simply too unusual to preserve. The role of these private keepers was not merely to hoard knowledge but to act as its discreet guardians, especially during times of intense political or religious upheaval. When a king or a bishop would order the confiscation or destruction of certain texts deemed heretical, it was often these private collections that provided a safe harbor. A nobleman's castle or a merchant's fortified townhouse offered a layer of protection that a monastery, subject to direct ecclesiastical authority, could not always guarantee. A text on ancient pagan philosophy or a daring new theological interpretation could be sealed in a chest, hidden behind a wall, or simply kept discreetly on a shelf, waiting for a more tolerant time. In this way, these private individuals became the essential backup system for the entire intellectual project of the age. They ensured that the diversity of thought was not entirely erased by periods of censorship or dogmatic enforcement, safeguarding ideas that would later be rediscovered and recognized as crucial to the progress of science and philosophy. Furthermore, the most generous of these collectors did not keep their treasures entirely to themselves. They became the nuclei of informal, invitation-only intellectual networks. A learned noblewoman might host a salon in her home, where trusted scholars and curious guests could be granted the rare privilege of examining her books, perhaps even hearing them read aloud. This created incredibly influential, albeit exclusive, circles of learning that operated parallel to the more formal university structures. In these intimate settings, ideas could be debated with a freedom that might be risky in a public disputation, and collaborations could form between people from different social classes, a merchant, a monk, and a nobleman, all brought together by their shared access to a rare collection of texts. The library was the star around which these intellectual planets orbited, a private universe of knowledge that its keeper could choose to illuminate for a select few, fostering a level of advanced, cross-disciplinary discussion that was often impossible elsewhere. These hidden libraries were not just storehouses, they were active, living centers of a quieter, more personal kind of scholarship, ensuring that the flame of inquiry was kept burning in countless private rooms, long before it was safe to bring it out into the open light of day. Yet for all the structured debate in the cathedral schools and the meticulous copying in the scriptoria, another powerful current of thought was flowing through the medieval world, one that turned inward rather than outward for answers. Mystical and esoteric traditions like Kabbalah in Judaism, Christian mysticism, and Sufism within Islam presented a radically different path to wisdom. These were not ways of learning that relied on dusty manuscripts or the approval of a master. They were journeys of the soul, prioritizing direct personal experience and inner revelation over external authority. In a world where religious institutions held immense power over the definition of truth, these paths offered a daring proposition that the divine could be encountered intimately by anyone willing to undertake the arduous, often secretive, work of purifying their own consciousness. This was knowledge not as a set of propositions to be debated, but as a transformative experience to be lived, a shift from understanding God to, in the words of the mystics, knowing God. These traditions developed elaborate and beautiful symbolic languages to express truths they believed were ineffable, too profound for ordinary words. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart used paradoxical poetry to point toward the divine, speaking of a desert of the Godhead and a silent eternity. Kabbalists mapped the process of creation and the human soul's journey through a complex diagram of the 10 Sephirot, envisioning divine energy flowing through these vessels like light through stained glass. Sufi poets like Rumi crafted thousands of verses using the metaphor of wine, drunkenness, and the beloved to describe the soul's ecstatic union with the divine. These were not mere literary flourishes. They were precise technical terms within their respective disciplines, a coded language designed to protect sacred mysteries from the unprepared while offering profound guidance to initiated seekers. The symbol acted as a key, unlocking layers of meaning that a literal reading could never access, ensuring that the deepest understandings were reserved for those who had done the inner work to deserve them. The methods for this inner work were as rigorous as any university curriculum, centered on deep meditation and contemplative prayer. A Sufi practitioner might engage in dhikr, the rhythmic repetition of the names of God, often accompanied by breathing exercises and movement to still the mind and open the heart. A Christian anchorite, walled into a small cell attached to a church, would spend years in silent solitude, systematically purging herself of attachments to worldly thoughts to become a clear vessel for divine grace. Kabbalists practiced kavana, an intense concentration on the letters of the Hebrew scriptures and the divine names, believing that through this mental focus they could align themselves with the creative forces of the universe. These were technologies of the self, disciplined practices aimed at fundamentally altering the practitioner's state of awareness to perceive a higher reality. The goal was not merely to learn about the divine, but to achieve a state of devekut in Kabbalah, cleaving to God, unio mystica in Christianity, mystical union, or fana in Sufism, the passing away of the self in God. Unsurprisingly, this intense focus on personal revelation often made institutional authorities deeply uneasy. A mystic who claimed direct access to God through experience could potentially bypass the interpretive authority of the church or the religious academy. Figures like Meister Eckhart were formally condemned for sermons that seemed to suggest the soul's core was identical to God, and the Beguines, communities of laywomen mystics, were frequently suspected of heresy for their independent religious expressions. Yet, despite this suspicion, these esoteric traditions became silent guardians for streams of ancient wisdom that more conventional institutions might have rejected. Neoplatonic ideas about the emanation of all reality from a single source, which had fallen out of favor in mainstream Christian theology, found a welcoming home in mystical thought. Similarly, pre-Christian concepts of the cosmos as a living, interconnected whole were preserved and elaborated within these frameworks, influencing later natural philosophy. The ultimate contribution of these mystical paths was their profound reimagining of the individual's relationship to the cosmos. They proposed that the human soul was not a distant, separate subject studying a detached world, but a microcosm, a tiny mirror of the entire universe, intimately connected to the divine source of all things. To know oneself deeply through introspection and spiritual practice was therefore to know the structure of reality itself. This was a holistic vision that saw no ultimate separation between the seeker and the sought, the student and the subject. It inspired a way of thinking that valued interconnection, intuition, and the wisdom of the heart alongside the logic of the mind. In doing so, the mystics ensured that the medieval quest for knowledge retained its wonder, its sense of mystery, and its ultimate goal of transcendent unity, balancing the analytical disputations of the schools with a timeless reminder that some truths can only be felt in the silence. For generations, knowledge had flowed like a great underground river through the hidden channels of medieval Europe, through the scriptoria, along the trade routes, and in the minds of wandering scholars. But by the 12th century, that river was rising to the surface, gaining power and momentum until it could no longer be contained by informal networks alone. A critical mass of teachers and students had gathered in the great urban centers, drawn by the magnetic pull of famous masters and the promise of opportunity. In cities like Bologna, a hub for the study of Roman law, and Paris, a center for theology and philosophy, these loose collections of scholars began to realize their collective strength. They were no longer just individuals seeking wisdom. They were a community with shared needs and shared vulnerabilities, and it was this recognition that sparked one of the most transformative innovations in history, the university. The model they turned to was not one of royal decree or ecclesiastical design, but one drawn from the bustling commercial world around them, the guild. Just as cobblers, weavers, and silversmiths had organized to protect their trades, set quality standards, and control who could practice their craft, so too did the masters of knowledge. They formed a universitas, a Latin term meaning simply a whole or a corporation. This was not originally a word for a place of learning, but for a legal entity, a guild of people. In some cases, like in Bologna, it was the students themselves who formed the powerful guild, banding together to hire masters, negotiate fees, and even dictate the pace of the curriculum to ensure they received the education they were paying for. In others, like Paris, it was the community of masters who united to form the guild, controlling who could teach, what could be taught, and upholding the standards of their intellectual trade. This was a bottom-up revolution, a move by the practitioners of learning to secure their own rights, stability, and professional standing in an unpredictable world. What were they seeking? Above all, they sought protection. A wandering scholar had no recourse if a local town magistrate decided to expel him, or if a jealous rival disrupted his lectures. A student from a foreign land was incredibly vulnerable, subject to exploitative landlords and often targeted by townspeople who resented the rowdy, privileged outsiders. By forming a corporation, they gained a powerful collective voice. The university could negotiate charters from popes, emperors, and kings that granted them crucial privileges: the right to govern their own members, to be tried in their own courts, and to suspend teaching, a powerful tool called a cessation, if their rights were violated. This legal autonomy created a protected space for intellectual life, a sanctuary where debate could flourish without the immediate threat of political or mob interference. It was the formalization of the safety that monasteries had once offered, now transplanted into the vibrant, contentious, and exciting world of the medieval city. This move towards formalization also brought a powerful drive for standardization. In the world of the invisible university, what you learned depended entirely on which master you found and what texts he had access to. The new universities sought to create a reliable, predictable product, a standardized education. They developed set curricula, the course of study every student was expected to follow. They defined the length of time required to master a subject, moving a student from the rank of baccalaureate to licentiate, and finally to master or doctor, titles that gave them the license to teach anywhere in Christendom. This system of degrees was the guild's way of certifying that a scholar had mastered the craft of knowledge, providing a portable credential that was recognized across Europe. It meant that a graduate from the University of Paris could be trusted to have a certain level of competence in theology, creating a common language of learning that transcended local borders and personal connections. Yet, for all this new formality, the earliest universities were still deeply indebted to their building-less origins. The University of Paris, for instance, did not begin with the iconic Sorbonne building we imagine today. For decades, it had no campus at all. Masters rented lecture halls in private homes or above market stalls. Teaching occurred in borrowed churches, in the open air of the left bank fields, or in any available space. The university was not a physical place, but a living, breathing community of people who happened to be in Paris. The core of education remained resolutely oral and communal. The lecture, the reading and explication of a set text, was the central event. The disputation, the formalized public debate, was the engine of intellectual advancement. The library was not a vast building but the aggregate of the masters' and students' personal book collections, shared and copied among themselves. The entire enterprise was built on the same principles of collaboration, oral transmission, and mobility that had sustained the invisible university for centuries. The great innovation was not in inventing new ways of learning, but in creating a durable, legal shell to protect the old ones, allowing the vibrant, decentralized spirit of medieval inquiry to finally put down roots and grow into something that would change the world forever. Centuries after those medieval scholars gathered in rented halls and under the shade of trees, the spirit of their invisible university is experiencing a breathtaking rebirth in our digital age. The core principles that allowed knowledge to survive the collapse of empires are now powering its greatest expansion in human history. We see this most vividly in the rise of massive open online courses, or MOOC, which have dismantled the ivory tower and placed its treasures on every smartphone. A student in a remote village can now learn quantum mechanics from a Nobel laureate at MIT, not because they were admitted to an elite institution, but because they possess curiosity and an internet connection. This is the modern equivalent of the wandering scholar bringing the teachings of Paris to a German town square, a democratization of learning on a scale the medieval mind could scarcely have imagined, yet one that operates on the same fundamental principle. Knowledge flows most freely when it is untethered from physical constraints. This digital revolution extends far beyond formal courses into the very fabric of how we access information. The monastic scriptorium, where monks labor to create a single precious copy of a text, has its direct descendant in the digital archive and the open-source repository. Projects like Google Books, the Internet Archive, and JSTOR have created a global, decentralized library more vast than any medieval patron could have dreamed of funding. A researcher today can cross-reference a 13th-century illuminated manuscript from the Vatican, a translated Arabic medical text from a university in Tehran, and a modern scholarly commentary from a professor in California, all within minutes and without leaving their desk. This interconnected web of knowledge is the ultimate realization of the trade route metaphor, where ideas travel at the speed of light instead of the pace of a camel caravan, yet it fulfills the same ancient promise of connecting disparate minds across vast distances. Perhaps the most profound echo of the medieval model is found in the resurgence of community-driven and peer-to-peer learning. Online forums, social media groups, and collaborative platforms like GitHub have become the bustling digital town squares and taverns where modern peripatetic scholars gather. A programmer in Brazil can contribute code to a software project managed by a team in Finland, troubleshooting problems together in a continuous, global disputation. A hobbyist historian can share their research on a subreddit dedicated to medieval warfare, receiving immediate feedback and citations from academics and enthusiasts around the world. These are self-assembling guilds of knowledge, where expertise is validated not by a formal degree but by the quality of one's contributions and the respect of one's peers, a direct parallel to the reputation-based economy of the wandering masters, whose authority came from their skill in debate, not a parchment diploma. This legacy challenges one of the most deeply ingrained assumptions of the modern world: that education must be housed in impressive, expensive, and permanent buildings. The medieval experience proves that the university is not a location, but an activity. It is the act of shared inquiry, the collaborative pursuit of understanding, and the resilient network of trust that forms between those who teach and those who learn. The grand campuses of Oxford, Harvard, and the Sorbonne are magnificent, but they are the fruit of the intellectual labor, not its root. The root is, and always has been, the human desire to know and to share what we have discovered. Today, as we grapple with the rising costs of traditional education and the urgent need for lifelong learning in a rapidly changing world, the lessons of the invisible university are more relevant than ever. They remind us that the future of learning may not lie in building bigger lecture halls, but in building better networks, in creating flexible, adaptive, and inclusive communities of curiosity that can thrive anywhere, from a monastery cloister to a virtual reality classroom, proving once again that knowledge only needs a mind to hold it and another mind to share it with. Faced with a flood of information and only the most basic tools to manage it, medieval scholars became the original information architects, devising brilliantly creative solutions to conquer the chaos of their growing libraries. Their challenge was immense. How do you quickly find a specific passage in a massive Bible or a complex theological argument within a 1,000-page manuscript that has no page numbers, no table of contents, and is one of only a few copies in existence? The answer was not to build bigger chests for storage, but to build better maps for navigation. They began to transform the book from a linear scroll of text into a multidimensional database, embedding layers of organizational genius directly onto the parchment itself. This was the birth of the Finding Aid, a suite of innovations that turned a passive object into an active tool for thought. One of the most transformative of these inventions was the development of sophisticated indexing systems. We take the alphabetical index for granted today, but its widespread adoption in the 13th century was a revolution in accessibility. Scholars like the Parisian canon, Hugh of Saint-Cher, and his team of Dominican friars undertook the Herculean task of creating a massive concordance of the entire Vulgate Bible. This was not a simple word list, it was a powerful retrieval tool. For every significant word, every mention of Jerusalem, covenant, or light, the concordance listed every single book, chapter, and verse where it appeared. To make this work, they first had to devise a standardized system for dividing the Bible into chapters and verses, a numbering system we still use today. This meant that a preacher preparing a sermon on faith could instantly locate every relevant passage across both the Old and New Testaments, weaving together a tapestry of quotes that would have taken weeks of manual searching to compile before. The index transformed the Bible from a story to be read sequentially into a modular dataset to be queried and cross-referenced, supercharging the pace of theological and legal argumentation. Beyond the index, scholars developed a visual language of knowledge management right on the page. They used intricate diagrams known as roti circular wheels with interconnecting spokes to map out complex relationships between concepts, such as the virtues and vices or the intricate layers of celestial hierarchy. A student could grasp the entire structure of a philosophical argument at a single glance. Tables and charts were employed to organize historical timelines or parallel narratives from the Gospels, creating a comparative view that made patterns and discrepancies immediately apparent. In the margins of texts, a system of annotations flourished. Readers would add manicules, small drawn hands with pointing fingers, to mark important passages. They developed a system of cross-referencing by writing keywords or symbols in the margins that corresponded to similar topics in other parts of the book, or even in entirely different volumes. A single page became a dense web of primary text, scholarly commentary, and navigational cues, representing the collective engagement of every reader who had ever held that book, each one leaving behind a trace of their intellectual journey. For the ultimate portable database, however, one needed to look no further than the human mind itself, trained through the art of memory. The memory palace, or method of loci, was the zenith of this cognitive technology. A scholar would mentally construct a vast, elaborate building, a familiar cathedral, their childhood home, or an entirely imagined palace. They would then carefully place each piece of information they needed to remember at a specific location within this mental architecture. A quotation from Aristotle on the doorstep, a list of medicinal herbs on the kitchen table, a complex theological argument waiting on the throne in the Great Hall. To retrieve the information, they would simply take a mental walk through their palace, seeing each concept in its designated spot. This technique leveraged the brain's innate strength for visual and spatial memory, turning abstract ideas into vivid, unforgettable images. A trained master could hold the equivalent of an entire library's worth of speeches, texts, and formulas in their head, ready to be delivered flawlessly without a single note. This was the most resilient information system imaginable, one that could not be burned, lost, or stolen, and that traveled everywhere its owner went. These methods, from the meticulously penned index to the glittering palaces of the mind, reveal a profound medieval truth. The greatest tool for managing knowledge has never been the technology of the day, but the limitless ingenuity of the human intellect. This fundamental tension between sharing and safeguarding knowledge was at the core of the medieval scholar's ethical dilemma. On one hand, there was a powerful conviction that wisdom, particularly that which illuminated the divine or healed the sick, was a gift from God intended for the benefit of all humanity. This belief drove the immense, selfless labor of the monastic scribe who copied medical texts, believing his work might one day alleviate suffering in a distant village he would never see. It motivated translators to painstakingly render complex philosophical works into vernacular languages, democratizing understanding and empowering those outside the clerical elite. This view saw knowledge as a sacred trust, a light that grew brighter the more widely it was shared, and its preservation was an act of profound piety and charity. To hoard such a gift was considered a moral failure, a sin against the collective advancement of humankind. Conversely, an equally persuasive argument cautioned that knowledge in the wrong hands was not a tool for construction but a weapon for destruction. This fear was not born of paranoia but from a realistic appraisal of human nature and the tumultuous world they inhabited. A detailed manual on metallurgy could be used to craft a better plowshare to feed a village, or it could be used to forge a sharper sword for a marauding army. The intricate symbolic language of alchemy, if decoded by someone without the proper moral and spiritual preparation, could be twisted for greedy pursuits of wealth or power, perverting a sacred spiritual journey into a base mechanical process. This perspective argued for a principle of graduated access, where deeper, more potent truths were concealed within layers of allegory and symbolism, revealed only to those who had proven their virtue, discipline, and intellectual maturity through years of study. This wasn't about elitism for its own sake, but a protective measure, akin to locking away a powerful medicine to prevent it from being taken as a poison. These ethical debates directly shaped the physical and intellectual strategies of preservation. The choice of what to copy was the first filter. A scriptorium under a particularly cautious abbot might prioritize devotional works and approved church fathers, while neglecting or even discarding pagan philosophical texts that were seen as potentially misleading or heretical. The very act of translation was an ethical minefield. Rendering a text from Latin into a common tongue could be viewed as either a noble act of liberation or a dangerous bypassing of ecclesiastical authority. Some texts were deliberately written in a highly technical or obscure style, not because the author lacked clarity, but to create a built-in audience filter. This ensured that only those with sufficient foundational training and the right intellectual references could truly understand the work, while the unprepared would simply dismiss it as nonsense. Knowledge was sometimes physically concealed, hidden in wall cavities or buried in chests, not to be lost forever, but to be protected from the immediate threat of censorship, destruction, or misappropriation until a more enlightened age could receive it. The echoes of these medieval ethical struggles are unmistakable in our own digital era. The debate over information privacy mirrors the ancient tension between secrecy for protection and transparency for sharing. We grapple with whether powerful personal data should be widely available for innovation or closely guarded to prevent manipulation, just as medieval scholars debated who should access powerful philosophical ideas. The digital divide is a modern incarnation of the Latin versus vernacular split, where access to high-speed internet and digital literacy skills now determine who can participate in the global conversation of knowledge, creating a new class of the information rich and the information poor. And the urgent contemporary discussions about the responsible use of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and surveillance tools are a direct parallel to the medieval fears about alchemy and advanced mechanics. We are asking the very same question they did. Just because we can do something with our knowledge, does that mean we should? The medieval experience offers no easy answers, but it provides a profound historical depth to our own dilemmas, reminding us that the ethical stewardship of knowledge is not a new problem, but a permanent and essential responsibility of every learned society. Yet, even as these networks of learning grew more formal and interconnected, they always existed under the shadow of authority. The medieval world was not a free marketplace of ideas. It was a landscape where religious and political powers maintained a vigilant watch over anything that might challenge doctrine, social order, or their own control. A philosophical argument from an ancient Greek text, a new astronomical observation, or a daring theological interpretation could swiftly be labeled dangerous, heretical, or seditious. The penalty for possessing or promoting such ideas wasn't just a reprimand. It could mean excommunication, imprisonment, exile, or even execution. This constant looming threat forced scholars and thinkers to become masters of subterfuge, developing a sophisticated toolkit of resistance to ensure that vital, if controversial, knowledge could survive the purges of the powerful. One of the most common and ingenious strategies was the art of concealment through coding and allegory. When a scholar wanted to explore a radical idea without attracting the attention of censors, they would often bury it within layers of symbolism or frame it as a harmless story. A treatise on alchemy, for instance, was rarely a straightforward chemical recipe. Instead, it was a fantastical narrative filled with kings and queens marrying, dragons being slain, and green lions devouring the sun. To the untrained eye or the suspicious inquisitor, this looked like superstitious nonsense or pious allegory. But to an initiated reader who understood the code, the chemical wedding was a precise metaphor for a specific reaction, and the green lion referred to a powerful chemical agent. This symbolic language acted as a perfect shield, protecting the practitioner from accusations of witchcraft or heresy, while allowing a secret scientific dialogue to continue across generations and continents. The true meaning was hidden in plain sight, visible only to those who possessed the key. When encoding wasn't enough, the strategy shifted to physical concealment. Precious manuscripts containing forbidden knowledge were not left on open shelves. They were hidden away in false-bottomed chests, sealed up within the walls of monasteries or castles, or buried in the ground to wait for a safer, more enlightened time. Some of the most important rediscoveries of the Renaissance came from these hidden caches, texts that had been deliberately safeguarded by their owners from the book-burning campaigns of overzealous authorities. The survival of these works often depended on the courage of individual keepers, a nobleman who defied an order to surrender his library, or an abbot who secretly preserved a text he'd been commanded to destroy. These acts were not merely about saving parchment and ink. They were a quiet, defiant bet on the future, a belief that the ideas within those pages would one day be recognized as valuable and true, even if the present moment deemed them too dangerous to exist. Perhaps the most resilient method of all, however, was the human network itself, the trusted circle of colleagues and students who operated as a kind of intellectual underground. Forbidden ideas were often circulated not in writing, but through hushed conversations in private chambers, encoded personal letters, or memorized speeches delivered only to a select and vetted audience. A master would share a controversial thought only with his most trusted disciples, who would in turn commit it to memory and perhaps share it orally with their own students years later. This created a fragile but incredibly durable chain of transmission, one that left no physical evidence for authorities to find. The knowledge lived in the minds of the faithful, passed like a secret from one generation to the next. It was a system built on immense personal trust and a shared commitment to the preservation of truth, no matter the cost. This history of resistance, of encoding, hiding, and secretly sharing, is a powerful testament to a fundamental human truth that the desire to know, to question, and to understand cannot be extinguished by force. It can be driven underground, it can be forced to speak in whispers and symbols, but it will always find a way to endure, waiting patiently for the moment it can once again step into the light. This quiet, centuries-long project of preservation, carried out in the shadows of the so-called Dark Ages, was not an end in itself. It was the patient laying of a fuse, and the spark that would ignite it came from an unexpected direction, the fall of a city that most Europeans had never seen. In 1453, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. While this was a catastrophic event for Christendom, it triggered an intellectual earthquake that would reshape the West. As scholars fled the falling city, they did not arrive empty-handed. They carried with them precious ancient Greek manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for a millennium, but were almost entirely unknown in Western Europe. These weren't just any books, they were original texts by Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and the great tragedians, works that the Latin West had only known through fragmented quotations, second-hand summaries, or poorly translated Arabic versions. The arrival of these texts was like discovering a complete, detailed blueprint for a civilization that medieval Europe had only known through a dusty, stained glass window. The impact was immediate and electric, particularly in the wealthy, competitive city-states of Italy. Wealthy patrons, especially the Medici family in Florence, became obsessed with acquiring these newly arrived treasures. They hired teams of scholars to translate them not into the scholarly Latin of the universities, but into the vibrant vernacular Italian, making them accessible to artists, architects, and poets. And what they found within these pages was nothing short of revolutionary. Here was Plato's philosophy, not filtered through the often grim lens of medieval theology, but in its full, original splendor, a vision of ideal forms, divine beauty, and the limitless potential of the human mind. This Neoplatonic idealism directly inspired artists like Sandro Botticelli, whose paintings, The Birth of Venus and Primavera, are not merely pretty pictures but profound philosophical statements, visualizing the Neoplatonic journey of the soul toward divine love and truth. The classical ideal of humanism, with its focus on human dignity, reason, and earthly achievement, suddenly had a powerful, ancient voice, challenging the otherworldly focus that had dominated medieval thought. This rediscovery also provided the essential tools for the period's breathtaking artistic and scientific advancements. The Roman architect Vitruvius's treatise De Architectura, rediscovered in a Swiss monastery library in 1414, became the Bible for Renaissance architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti. Its detailed descriptions of classical proportions and engineering principles directly enabled the construction of the Duomo in Florence, a feat that had been considered impossible for centuries. Meanwhile, the recovery of Euclidean geometry and Archimedean mathematics provided the precise language needed for the revolutionary developments in perspective painting. Artists could now create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface with mathematical certainty, transforming art from a decorative craft into a science of vision. The works of Ptolemy, reintroduced to Europe, challenged its geographical understanding of the world, eventually inspiring explorers like Columbus to sail westward, believing in a spherical Earth that ancient wisdom had already described. Perhaps the most profound connection lies in the very method of thinking that the invisible university had nurtured. The medieval scholastic tradition, with its relentless emphasis on disputation, questioning authority, and reconciling reason with faith, had trained generations of minds in rigorous critical thinking. The Renaissance did not discard this method, it simply redirected it. The same intellectual energy that a medieval scholar might have poured into debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin was now channeled into questioning the natural world through direct observation and experiment. The spirit of inquiry remained, but its object shifted from purely theological speculation to the wonders of the human body, the mechanics of the physical universe, and the recovery of the classical past. The invisible university had kept the flame of logical inquiry burning through the long night, and the Renaissance used that very same flame to illuminate a new world of artistic, scientific, and humanistic discovery, proving that the most powerful revolutions are not sudden explosions, but the long-awaited harvest of seeds planted by forgotten hands. The story of the invisible university is ultimately a story about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. For centuries, through unimaginable hardship, people found a way to protect the fragile flame of understanding, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed it mattered. They understood that knowledge is more than just facts in a book. It is the collective memory of our species, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, and the very tool we use to build a better future. They carried this responsibility not in stone buildings, but in their own hands and minds, proving that the most powerful educational institution is not a place you can find on a map, but a commitment we make to each other and to the future. This history speaks directly to our own moment. We live in an age of incredible abundance where the sum total of human knowledge is available at our fingertips, yet we also face new challenges of misinformation, digital divides, and information overload. The lesson from the medieval world is not that we should abandon our universities and libraries, far from it. Instead, it's a reminder that the true heart of learning has always existed in the spaces between institutions. It lives in our innate curiosity, in our willingness to collaborate with others, and in our stubborn refusal to let go of a good question until we find an answer. The medieval scholars teach us that the format may change, from illuminated manuscripts to digital screens, from memory palaces to cloud servers. But the essential human drive to know, to understand, and to share remains our greatest constant. So the next time you watch an online tutorial to learn a new skill, contribute to a Wikipedia article, or even explain a complex idea to a friend, remember that you are participating in a tradition that is centuries old. You are a citizen of the invisible university. You are helping to keep the flame alive, adding your own light to a chain of illumination that stretches back through time. The medieval guardians of knowledge have passed the torch to us. It is now our turn to ensure it continues to burn brightly for all, proving once and for all that knowledge once kindled can never truly be extinguished. If you enjoyed this journey through history and the hidden resilience of the human mind, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own thoughts and reflections in